why we are the way we are. So we thought that, well, okay, I'm going to tell you how I grew up. And then your mother is going to tell you how she grew up. And then we're going to tell you again how we met and what happened after that that brought you all into the world.
Oh.
Wow.
There's some details in that you do not have to tell.
I've been chosen to begin.
Please.
I want you
begging
to
you.
know
There's children present. Related.
that I was born in Wisconsin.
Jeez.
As a matter of fact, I was born
The Nutshell.
2 months before the stock market crashed in 1929.
So it's your fault.
Yes. And at that time, my mother and father and my father's sisters lived in the Poltrock household that was built by my grandfather, who had come up from Germany through Chicago to Kenosha, Wisconsin. And at that time, we all lived together in the house. And there was only plumbing on the first floor. There was no plumbing on the second floor. So I grew up with chamber pots and cold water.
Can you explain chamber pots?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Depression years. Well, during the Depression years, as I was in grade school, the neighborhood was predominantly Italian and Catholic. I was raised by predominantly German, anti-Catholic people. The Catholic, we always had this conflict going. The Catholics would yell, Catholics, Catholics, ring the bell. Baptists, Baptists, go to hell. That was the neighborhood. The neighborhood, being predominantly Italian, was also deeply associated with the mafia. Now, what I tell you is the truth, that within 1 block of where I live, there were 4 mafia assassinations. I mean, the weapon of choice was the shotgun. Right. And they were involved in bootlegging and the numbers racket, but that was before dope became really popular. But in terms of bootlegging, if you were with the wrong group and you stepped out on your front porch, you're liable to be greeted with some double-aught buckshot, because the Cavellis and the Cicchinis and the Savaglios and the Cosentinos were all killed within walking distance of our house. And that's the neighborhood I grew up in. And
I didn't know that.
So had they crossed this was the days of Capone and the Irish Mafia?
oh, well,
Yeah.
no, this was
Irish
strictly
mafia?
Italian, right?
Huh?
Just Italian.
But it was the.
But were they part of
Oh,
Capone's?
I don't know if Capone was involved.
Don't
in
know.
that. We were 60 miles from Chicago, so it could have been.
Could have been.
Yeah. But anyhow, I went to grade school, and at that time, since we all lived together in this house, my mother and father finally moved out. But they left me with my aunts. And I was raised predominantly from the time I was 4 years old by 2 German homemade aunts. Now, if you're not familiar with the Germans centered around food. So we always had a lot to eat. If you wanted chicken, here's a whole chicken. Right? If you wanted ice cream, here's a pound of ice cream. Right? Right? So I grew up kind of a chubby kid. Struggled my way through the 6th grade, and probably about 40 pounds overweight, but I was happy. I outweighed most of the Italians anyhow. Nothing eventful happened during my grade school years, but when I got to junior high, the war started. in 1942, well, 1941 when they bombed Pearl Harbor, I was still living with my aunts. 1942, labor was scarce.
But you
Yeah.
didn't tell about the part about listening to Hitler with your aunts in the 30s. You gotta tell that.
Wow.
You gotta tell that.
Oh,
Yeah, that
All right.
World War II.
my aunts being German, by the way, I grew up listening on the radio to Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, you kids, all you grandkids, everybody
You
should
don't
know
understand
this.
this,
Nobody, you know.
But they thought Adolf Hitler was a god.
Oh,
Now, Germany had just come through a huge, huge depression. And Adolf Hitler, of course, was the political movement that brought the political movement that raised Germany up out of the depression into, again, a world power.
Brown shirts.
But what we didn't know was that he was also arming Germany at the same time. So, as he brought, and my aunts were from Germany. Of course, all my uncles were from Germany also, and my grandfather. Anyhow, they thought that Adolf was a hero. And they used to listen to his radio broadcasts. And I remember laying there in bed with my Aunt Ann in this feather bed that just sunk you in, and listening to a 3-hour Adolf Hitler speech in German. But they understood German, and they explained to me what was happening. But they also, the German-American Hall was about a mile from where we lived. And they used to take me over there, and we walk into this German-American Hall. This was like in 1938, 39, before the war. And you'd walk into this huge hall, and on both sides were these big banners of red and black swastikas. And in the front were all these guys standing up with these brown shirts with the Sam Brown belts over them with these little hats on, you know, and they were highly.
oh my God.
This was in America?
So,
No, not America.
I didn't see
Kenosha.
anything wrong with At that time, you know. But
Ach, they're leaving.
after the war started, of course, opinions changed. Yeah. So, my parents moved out and left me with the aunts. My brother Jerry was there also. Now, you all met Jerry, the fire chief. And we live with my aunts.
Why did you say
Where was
fire chief?
Fire chief. That's so you remember him.
Where was
Square.
Don then?
Out here?
Pyro.
So I went
Duncan.
to junior high school. Our junior high school was grades 7th, 8th, and 9th at that time. And I used to walk 2.5 miles to get to junior high school. But nothing really significant happened except that in 1942 there was a shortage of manpower. And I remember playing in the park, and this conservation agent came and said, "We're looking for people who worked on farms." Now here's this chubby kid, right? It's probably 40 pounds overweight. What do you work on farms? Well, okay, we're gonna work on farms. So they farmed me out. And I moved in with this farm family out in the country. And I learned to milk cows, slop the hogs, plow the fields, cultivate corn, hull corn, ran thrashing machines, and all this in 3 months in the summertime. They paid me $1 a day. But they never paid me.
That's the American way.
During that time, now, I was in the 7th and 8th grade, the 7th grade. I went from a chubby little kid to a hard rock farm kid, right?
I bet you did.
So that when I was in junior high, I started to take part in sports. Now, my brother was really an excellent athlete. He was 2 years older than I was, and he was in high school. And he was like all pro, all state, everything. Natural basketball player. It was dangerous to play basketball with him because you never knew which way the ball was going to come from. He was so quick. But he told me that, hey, if you're in junior high school, you can still play football at the high school. So during football season when I was in the 9th grade, I'd hop on the bus, go down to the high school and play football with the high school kids. And so by the time I got to high school, I was a fairly well-developed high school athlete. And so I played football for 3 years in high school. In fact, nothing else happened except I was part of the first gang movement in Kenosha High
Gang
School.
movement?
Gang.
Oh, gang.
Gang. We had a gang.
Not gay.
Italians?
No,
Germans?
No Italians allowed. We were all Anglos.
Okay.
The Italian conflict had resolved itself by then because they were just absorbed. In
You
the
ought to
American-
tell them about the one Jewish man in your group who's very famous.
We did have a Jew.
Well,
yes.
tell 'em about it.
Right. Anyhow, well, the name of the gang was Mel's Flying Club. Now, Mel was a Jew. But believe it or not, Mel grew up to be world famous.
Mel Torme?
Mel Gibson.
What is wrong with this?
No,
Yep.
Mel grew up to be a world famous fly fisherman.
First class.
Really?
You see him on television.
Top notch.
Really?
Yeah. He takes groups all over the world that fly
Writes
fishing.
books.
Anyhow, that was
What's
Mel's
his-
Flying
what's
Club.
his name? Mel
But
what?
our gang was
Krieger.
predominantly, we didn't do anything bad. We just did a lot of drinking and carousing. But the rule one was you never have anything to do with girls.
No girls.
The
Girls
gay
were
gang?
not part
That was
of
the
it.
He-Man woman. That was the He-Man woman haters
All
club.
right, that's right. We never had trouble with
I'm
girls.
confused.
Anyhow, so I got through high school okay.
Well, you didn't tell that you worked for the postal department.
Oh, Jesus. The labor shortage was so bad that when I was in the 9th grade, they hired me to drive a U.S. mail truck.
In the ninth
Now, I was
grade.
like 14 years old. Didn't have a driver's license, and I had to haul the U.S. mail from the post office 6 blocks to the railroad station and throw the mail sacks on the
And
plane.
that's
Did
good
they
money.
pay
That's
you?
good money. in
Right.
Did they pay
I
you?
wore
Did
this
they pay you?
pistol.
Pistol.
14 years old.
Right, I used to throw the mail sack, this gun hanging down my leg. Because you had to guard the mail, because they used to ship money through the mail. So I knew that.
Not too far from
I
Pony
did that for like
Express.
a year and a half. And the old Model A trucks, never had a driver's license. When we had
Oh,
money,
my God.
I used to have 2 cops at the back, in a squad car following me to the railroad station so to load the money on the trains. And
Wow.
I was 14 years
Did
old.
you ever use your gun?
Well,
I
No,
bet you
never.
didn't
Just
know.
against the Italians?
Oh, I used to play with it, like all kids would do. I pulled it out to it.
Ah.
Did you learn from the Italians?
What?
Did you learn how to use a gun from the Italians?
Oh, geez, no, the Italians never do that. Anyhow, when I graduated from high school,
Don't make it too long.
no, but I have,
We wanted to get to the juicy parts.
High school, we got through high school.
so, I guess that's the way I grew up. I lived like foster care, right? Never lived with my parents. And my folks were divorced the day I graduated from junior high school. My father was a drunk, and you couldn't trust him. He'd sell everything we had just to buy booze. And my mother did the best she could to raise us, but we were pretty much independent. I grew up independent. I don't think you could really say I had a family. At least I didn't have a family until I got married. But that's coming.
That's so sweet.
Yeah. Anyhow, what I wanted to really talk about was events that happen in your life that you have no control over that make a serious impact on who you are and what happens to you. I mean, these are the things that shape your existence. And the first thing is that when I graduated from high school, it was in June of 1947, right after the war. My aunt, the aunt that I had lived with, decided to go to California in about, must have been September, to see her sister who lived in San Jose. And she took me with her. So we went by train to Oakland, California, went to San Francisco, met by my aunt, who took us to the top of the mark and all those sightseeing places in San Francisco, and we went down to San Jose. Now, they were supposed to be there 2 weeks. Well, I was 18 years old. I lasted about 2 days, and I thought, oh, there are better things than this. So I decided to go to Los Angeles. I had an uncle in Los Angeles. So back then, much different than today, I hitchhiked. I got out on the highway and hitchhiked to Los Angeles. Now, I don't remember how I met my uncle down there or how I ever found out where he was, but I did wind up there. And I stayed with them for 3 or 4 days or 5 days, and they did me all the touristy things in Los Angeles. They were horsey people. They had horses. So I learned to ride horses, and I learned to rope calves and all that stuff. And I kind of extended my stay there for 2 or 3 days, and then it petered out, and so I had to go back up to San Jose to see where my aunt was. So I hitchhiked back up there, but on the way up there, I ran into this guy who went to Yosemite National Park. So I hopped in the car with him. We went to Yosemite for 3 or 4 days. And then I wound up back in San Francisco. But when I got there, I got this message that my mother had fallen through a trapdoor and broken her spine. Now, this is the first significant event in my life at that time that changed my life. Because I know that if that hadn't happened, I would have stayed in California. And I would have stayed in probably San Francisco. Now, you know all of San Francisco today, but this was in 1947. Things were different. So I had my train ticket because my aunt had gone and I was out there all alone. And so I came back to Wisconsin. And my mother and my younger brother and younger sister were living with her sister, and they had no visible means of support, so I took a job in a factory. And I went to work for the Simmons Company making mattresses. And this was in the fall of 1947. Well, I did really well. And so the first significant event was, hey, my mother falls through a trapdoor, I have to leave California, change my whole life and come back to Wisconsin again, because I had already left. And so I was working in the factory. Now, you got to remember that Kenosha, Wisconsin was a primarily factory town. Your career was to graduate from high school, go to work in a factory, spend your 30 years, get a gold watch, and retire on Social Security. That was life then. So I started in the factory, and I was a pretty good mattress maker. But the second significant event was that one of my aunts in San Francisco had a husband who was in the Navy, and his father died. They lived in Kankakee, Illinois. His father did. So her husband had to come back to Kankakee, Illinois, to the funeral. And it turned out that he inherited a car, 1936 Ford Coupe. And after he left Kankakee, he came back up to Kenosha to see his sister-in-laws. And he had to go back to California. He was stationed at the naval base in Alameda, California. And he only had 2 days to get there. So they said, somebody has to help him drive to California. Now, I'm working in Simmons Company, making probably $150 a week, which was really good money in 1947 compared to what we make today, but that was good money. You know? And I was supporting my mother and their sisters, and things were going well, but my mother was getting better. So they tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, help him drive to California. I didn't have a driver's license. I still didn't have a driver's license because there were no cars. You know, in 1948, there were no cars.
That's right.
The industry had gone from war production to civilian production, but to buy a car, you had to know somebody back in 47 and 48 because you just weren't making them. So anyhow, they said, hey, you got to help your uncle drive to California. And another cousin also was tapped. So we got in this little coupe, 3 of us. only one seat, no heater, January or February. And we started out, we drove across the country to California, freezing cold. And I remember going through Wyoming, and it was just unbearable, right? I remember an elk jumping over the hood of the car as we drove through the mountains, you know. So anyhow, we got to California, and I'm living with my aunt, who was in Alameda at the naval base, and I couldn't. It was just a military housing, and I thought, well, I can't handle this. Back to Los Angeles. So, back in the thumb, I hitchhiked back to Los Angeles. This was 1948 in the winter. And I went back to my aunt and uncle, and they took me in. And I lived with them. And they got me a job in the garment industry. And I learned to be a leather cutter and how clothes were put together. I did that for a lot of years. I remember I started at $1 an hour. But that's how I got back to Los Angeles again, and I stayed there. I lived in a rooming house with a bunch of really neat people, Ivy League college graduates, bums, drunkards. We all lived together. We used to play poker, and we played bridge, and we drank, and we just had a good time for 2-3 years that we lived there together. And that's really when I grew up. I finally got a car of my own. I think it was a 1936 Ford, right? They quit running the day after I bought it. But, and I was in touch with my aunt and uncle, and we really, we did a lot of horseback riding, a lot of horsey things. In Griffith Park, we used to ride every Sunday and every Wednesday night, and all these really neat things with the Hollywood people and all that. And I lived in this boarding house, and I forgot to pay the rent. I went for like 6 weeks, never paid rent. 2 old maid ladies ran it. Finally, they closed it down, and we all moved out. And I moved up to Hollywood, and I moved in again with a group of people that were professional people. And we all lived together in this apartment. And the next significant event that happened in my life is I got drafted. 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and Harry Truman set up a draft call, and I was number 1. I was 21 years old. I was in the first draft call for Los Angeles.
Wow.
Were you literally
That was
number
another
one?
significant event. I had no control over that, but it changed my entire life. Right? Now, the next significant event happened to be a thing called the Snowball. Now, for those of you that don't understand, the Snowball was back in 1950, Michigan and Ohio State were vying for the Big Ten championship. And they played the game in Ohio State. And the Saturday that they played it was this horrendous snowstorm. You could not see across the street, let alone the lines on a football field. They played this football game in a snowstorm, and I think they punted each team like 18 times. That's all they did was punt. They couldn't run, they couldn't pass or anything. But the significant thing is that Michigan wound up winning. Right? Now, why is that significant in my life? I'm in California, laying on the beach, you know, living in Hollywood, and just enjoying life. Well, your mother's sister was going to the University of Michigan, and Michigan was going to the Rose Bowl game. Therefore, your mother couldn't send her sister without sending Nancy. So Nancy gets to go to the Rose Bowl game. It just turned out that the rooming house I was living in was run by Nancy's aunt and uncle. And so when they came in the fall or December, it was actually December of 1950, that's when I met your mother. However,
However.
I had a girlfriend
Oh.
who suddenly disappeared.
Good.
And I spent 2 or 3 days escorting your
I'm the
mother
killer.
and her sister around Hollywood and Mulholland Drive and showing her all the sights, got her on television. But I had quit working, by the way. I was drafted. I was leaving for the Army on December 2nd, 1951. So I'd been drafted in 1950, so I quit working in like December, first part of December, so I had all this free time. I had a car, and we went, we took her
January
all
2nd.
around.
January 2nd.
January.
What?
January 2nd, right?
January 2nd.
Yeah, you were gonna go, yeah.
December.
Oh, no.
I was just trying to figure this out.
I quit working in
Yeah.
December.
Took a year off.
And so that's how I met your mother. Now, she can, we'll pick it up from there, but she's gonna go over what she grew up on.
Oh.
Match that.
I can't. I could never match that.
Wow.
Well,
Guns.
By the way, I always say that I'm an orphan.
Now.
Yeah, I am an orphan, right? My father was a drunk.
Poor baby.
My mother had a child out of wedlock, as you all know.
Holly.
So how in the hell did I
Like
wind
your
up the way I am? You can't blame that on heredity.
Can you go back to the missing girlfriend part? Because are you saying that mom had something to do with
I
that?
got to know about that too, Chuck.
I don't know, I never saw her again.
Oh.
She was no match for Mom.
Way to go,
She
Mom.
just
Wait.
No match.
Didn't she end up being the wife of Topol in Fiddler on the Roof? Wasn't that the girl?
No,
No.
that was her sister.
Did she jump off an aircraft carrier in some movie you made up?
Oh,
Oh, that was,
You did do that.
Fell for that
Oh,
for
wait,
years.
wait.
that was one of the movies I was in.
Well,
Wait. 30 seconds.
well,
Okay.
as he said, I can't top that. As you all know, I was born in Muskegon.
Start over.
Potty break.
Okay, are you ready?
No.
Now
No.
this is extemporaneous. I mean, we didn't tell each other what we were gonna say, so I don't know what I'm gonna say. And if I ramble, just let me know. Do you have me? You
He's
know,
got you.
I was born in 1933.
You're rambling.
I knew it. And I was born in Hackley Hospital in Muskegon. Your grandma and your grandpa worked at a big oil refinery in Muskegon. And your Uncle Jim wasn't born yet. So anyway, I lived there till I was 5 years old. And I used to go to Oakview School. My mother tried to make me go to school, but I'd always turn around and come home. She couldn't keep me in school because I didn't like it. She also told me I painted the garage black, and she had to go to the gas station and get some stuff to try to take the black paint off of me. And they told her not to scrub me because it would hurt me, and she took me downstairs and scrubbed the devil out of me to get that black paint off. And I do remember that. I do remember. So that was Muskegon. And your grandma and grandpa were just had good times. I remember lots of people around all the time. So then they moved to Granville. They lived in a house on Washington Street that's still there.
no,
Lived
it's
there.
not, dear.
Yeah, yes it is. Mhm. Across from Posthumous Funeral Home, the second or third house in where Mr. Taylor
Oh,
used to
that's
live.
right. They lived up there first.
They moved there first.
Yes.
And they rented
Got
it.
that.
We've got some pictures of it, yeah. And Charlene and I, just normal kids. Then they rented that house down on Washington Street, a little further down, the one that you guys own. Yeah, they rented it for a long time before they finally bought it for $4,000, I think. Is that right?
I think they paid 6.
Oh, something.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I still had a hard time going to school. I didn't like school. No, I'd always come back home. And Mother would send me off again. Well, anyway, got through grade school. My best friend lived next door. And we literally were like sisters. I didn't have much to do with your Aunt Charlene because we didn't have anything in common. But I guess I was quite a naughty little girl. I bet you didn't know that.
I'm figuring it out
I bet you
now.
are. Well, I got into, as you know, I started piano lessons when I was 6, and I didn't like it, so they stopped. I didn't take lessons again until I was 7, and so then I caught on, and I loved it from then on. And I began the oboe in the 6th grade, and I was in the Granville High School band in the 6th grade. And I stayed in the band till I was a senior, because I was very good on the oboe.
So with Mr. Brower?
Yeah, and then I remember that when I was probably about in the 8th grade, I was a cheerleader for the high school, but I hated that. So I didn't stay in cheerleading very long. But I got to high school and oboe and piano, and that's all I thought about. I played for the choir. I started going to community concerts downtown all the time, the symphony, when I was 6th grade on. So you can see how the music all just came into it. I mean, I was nothing but music. That's all that mattered to me. I didn't care about the boy. I mean, I dated a lot, but I didn't care about them. I used to play for the Methodist Church, and I used to play in a jazz band on Saturday night, and I'd play for church on Sunday, and I was in the 8th grade. And I remember I used to clean the church on Saturday in the sanctuary. I used to sweep. They paid me $4 a week. I was in 8th grade. Then when I got into high school, I was naughty. I was so bored in school. I remember I got kicked out of home ec class for giggling. Then
That was naughty.
got kicked out of biology for giggling.
Oh,
I was an awful
That's
giggler.
naughty.
I liked a good time, and Mary and I were still good friends. Mary Gay Heisler. We used to do naughty things like stuff perfumed hankies into the steam radiators, especially in one class, economics, where they had to. Everybody had to get out of the classroom because it smelled like perfume. And Mary and I just took off and had a good time. We were awfully naughty. And, but it was just because we were bored. And I was still in the band. I was drum majorette, played oboe, and accompanied everything and everybody on their instruments. And graduated 10th or 11th in my class. Tried to get to the University of Michigan, but my Mr. DeWitt told me because I was a girl, he was going to give a scholarship to Fred Renaud. So I went to Grand Rapids Junior College because I couldn't get a scholarship to the University of Michigan. And I went to JC for a year. And then I went to the University of Michigan finally as a piano major. But in that time, when I was a senior in high school, Charlene had the opportunity to go to California to the Rose Bowl. Well, Mr. Grimes, who Dad worked for, didn't like the idea that Charlene was going to go and I couldn't go because Dad and Mom couldn't afford it. It cost $200 to take the train out to California. So he said, I'll pay her way, and you send Nancy. So I went. And if I hadn't gone, Sally Story would have been your mother.
That wasn't the girlfriend.
Yeah, Sally Story and Sarah Murray, whose father was the principal of the high school at that time, and Charlene and I went. We stayed in Aunt Peggy's. And then your father escorted us all over Mulholland Drive in California. And indeed, he got me on television. And they said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a freshman at the University of Michigan. And I was a senior in high school. And he said, do you belong to a sorority? And I said, no, I don't believe in them. And I'll never forget that. And then we went back, and your dad went in the troop train that way, and I was in the Michigan train and went that way. And then we wrote letters for 2 years. And he came back, he'd come back and visit. He met Mom and Dad and visit. And at the time, the seniors went, for our senior class trip, we'd take a boat to Chicago. And it was called the it was called the, oh heck, I don't remember. Well, anyway, it left from Holland, and our senior class got on this boat, and we were going to Chicago, and Tom, your dad, met me in Chicago, in uniform. So here's this boat, all my classmates pulling into Chicago, and here's your dad. all handsome in his uniform. And he said, oh my gosh. I said, yeah, it's my new boyfriend. Here in California. And your dad was with me, and we went to see South Pacific at the Schubert Theater in Chicago. And so anyway, I was still a senior, and then our romance was by letters, which tells me to tell you, follow your heart, because I really didn't literally date your dad. You know, we didn't go out dates each week and all that. We did our romance by marriage, or by letters, I should say. So then when we were married, we lived in Chicago, where Jeff was born, in West Suburban Hospital in Chicago. And we lived on Harlem Avenue in a little apartment where Jim came to visit us. He was 10 years old. We lived in the living room had a pull-down sofa for a bed. We had a kitchen. It was probably smaller than this room.
I was gonna say, it was about the size of this room.
Half this room. And there was a bathroom and then a little tiny place for the nursery right off the bathroom. We lived there about a year and a half. Your dad used to work 2 jobs, and he'd work at night, and he left me with a German Luger gun, which I wouldn't know how to shoot.
Cool.
Got that from a Nazi, didn't you?
Got it from some sheriff where he worked at.
That's my dad.
Oh, I worked at Motorola with him. I worked in the Motorola plant in Chicago too. I couldn't stand it. I was pregnant, I was sick, and yeah, I quit. So anyway, yeah, we lived there for about a year and a half, and then we came back. Your dad decided he was going to go to school. And the only way he could go to school, because we had no money, was to live with Mother and Dad on Washington Street when Jeff was a baby. We stayed in my old bedroom for a year, the 3 of us, with Mother and Dad. It was interesting. When your dad would work while he was going to school, he carried his big load at school. How many credits?
18, 19.
And he worked at a General Motors plant way over on the northeast side on Alpine. And where else did you work?
You might mention that he went
Stamping plant.
Yeah, the
You might
steel-
mention that he went to a Catholic school.
Oh, that's right. And but he was still at JC then.
Oh, was he still?
Yeah,
at JC?
and then he
Okay.
graduated from JC. Yeah, then he went to Aquinas. And he graduated from Aquinas. Then we moved to Crawford Street, which is Madison Square. It's all black now. I mean, it's not a very good neighborhood, I should say, really. And then I got pregnant for Greg, and that was 1959. You were born, Greg, and we lived on Jefferson Street, which is also not a very good neighborhood now. Okay, and then he graduated in 1959 from Aquinas. And then he was turned down by the Grand Rapids school system to get a job, and so he took a job with Godwin. And at Godwin, he got all kinds of doors open for him because he not only taught math and football, but then it gradually developed into his job with South Kent Community Education. And at that time, I was the organist at South Congregational Church. And then we moved to Plath Street, and we got pregnant for Melissa. And on Plath Street, 18 months later, we got pregnant. Stuart was born. And so we had, those are the places where we lived in all that time. And little things I can remember about all of you is Jeff, when you were a baby. I remember 5 o'clock one morning I could hear you, but you were outside. And you were out on the street in your tricycle. So you had a thing for
Got a
wheels.
ride, Mom.
Well, you had this thing for wheels when you were little.
I still got a thing for
5 o'clock in
wheels.
the morning, you were out there on your tricycle.
Been trying to tell you.
I know. And then, Greg, when you were born, I can remember catching you
Play the
on
piano.
Plath Street.
Falling out of a tree.
No, you was upstairs, and I had hidden all of our Christmas presents, and I bought you a little top. It was musical. And you got up there, and you found that top. And you were sitting there absolutely fascinated with that top. And you didn't even hear me come in.
Anything that
You loved
spins.
music from day one. And it's written in your baby book, and you were just musical. Melissa, you came along and you just kept me busy. We've got pictures of you crawling in and out of the cupboards. I mean, you were busy every minute.
She's kind of like our monkey, huh, Mom?
She was a girl. She was a girly girl. Girly girls are different. Very active. Stuart, you came along and you just,
Slept.
yeah, he was just real easygoing and just, you know.
Mr. Casual.
Yeah, Mr. Casual. And anyway, then we moved to Barrett Street, and that's where all.
That's where you bought the Bismarck.
Well, I put an ad, I put an ad in the paper, and I said, wanted 4-bedroom home in Granville. And Kip Moore had called me. He said, I've got this home for sale. We didn't even, I mean, he called me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we were
Where?
really blessed, except for Ray Jeff.
My neighbors.
When Dad
Well, that'd
wanted
be
to go
a
back to
Granville.
school at Aquinas, he couldn't go because the GI Bill ran out.
That's right.
So Dad, what happened?
What?
Thanks to him.
Your GI Bill had run out, so you couldn't go back to
Tell
school.
him-
What
tell him
happened?
I'll get
about Jerry
there.
Ford.
Okay, that's
When it comes my
part
turn
two.
again.
Well, tell him about Jerry Ford.
I'll tell you.
Because
Oh,
they've
wait.
got they all have a story, and we don't want to carry this on too long.
And where were you
I have
married?
some other
I don't
things
know.
to share.
We were married at the Granville Methodist Church
In 19.
1953.
53.
Jeff was
Hold that.
born in 54.
Ah, good.
I got pregnant. Oh, it is good. I got pregnant a month or two
Always
after
one.
we were married. Yeah, really.
Okay.
He was
I
born in
didn't know.
Chicago.
Yeah. We were born in Chicago.
Yeah.
I was only, I was
I was a
20 when you
TV
were
star.
Sort of.
born. Yeah. So, I was 19 when I got married.
Wow.
But as I say, follow your heart, and I did. And I'm glad. Okay, they all have something to say too.
No, I got something to say yet.
Oh,
But one of our grandkids just left. I want to talk to them.
He'll be back. Potty break.
No.
Want to
Talk
wait?
about
Yeah.
significant events. All right.
what?
There are several significant events that you don't know about yet in my life. But they primarily will impact the grandkids. One of them is that you can never take anything for granted. There's a significant event that happened in my life. The end result is that I wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be here if what had happened had actually impacted us. When I was 9 years old, remember I lived with my aunts, my Aunt Ann, and I was airplane crazy. Everything was airplane, before the war, you know, everything. Planes used to fly over going from Milwaukee to Chicago and back and forth. We sat out in the backyard just in awe of those old Fokker tri-motor planes that flew back and forth. Well, because I was so crazy about airplanes, she took me to an air show at the Kenosha Airport, one of those old-fashioned air shows with the barge-swarming pilots. And she decided that we would take an airplane ride. But when it came time to get in the plane, she found out that she had forgotten her purse. Now, how many times does a woman leave home and forget her purse? How often does that happen in your life? Basically, very seldom, right? So, I don't know what the cost was to go for the plane ride, but it was a one plane enclosed cabin like a paper cup. But they carried 2 passengers and we were going to go for a plane ride. So we only lived about 4 or 5 miles from the airport, and we had this old Packard automobile that my mother drove. And by the way, I was living with my aunts then, but my mother and father were still together when I was 9 years old. So they hopped in the car and they drove back home, got her purse, came back to the airport, and she had the money to pay for it. It probably cost all of $5 to do this. And as we got back to the airport, we walked out on the tarmac in front of the hangar, and this guy said, well, the pilot couldn't wait for you. He had to go back to wherever he was going. And he had to take 2 people with him. So there we stood, and here is, I remember looking out over that, it was a grassy airfield. There was no tarmac or asphalt in there. And I see this plane heading out into west, it was in the afternoon, the sun set, taking off, and there we're talking about well, what are we going to do? We want to go up for a plane ride. And he said, well, try this plane. It was a two-winger with open cockpit. My Aunt Ann wouldn't go for that. And so we're watching the plane, and he takes off, and he turns around, and he comes back, and all of a sudden it went whoop, and boom, right in front of us. Crashed. Straight down. I remember the pilot coming out of the flames of the plane, all burned. The two passengers that would have been my aunt and me died in that plane crash. So you have no control over what happens in your life. I don't believe in predestined events. I think that things happen to you as you go through life. Right? The other thing is that going back to going to school. Now, I had the fortune to go to school under the GI Bill. They paid me like $160 a month. I had to pay room and board for 2 kids, tuition and books out of $160 a month. So, but we did it. I mean, you know, we struggled. It wasn't easy. I worked a 40-hour job, plus going to school, carrying all those credits. I was in pre-engineering, took all those math courses. And then I got into the driving school business, and I started my own driving school. I taught people to drive and finish up, which was kind of nice because I had a flexible schedule to contain my own hours. But the way my career went, when I finished at the junior college, I was pre-engineering. I was going to be some kind of an engineer. But the driving school was going so well that we couldn't leave Grand Rapids. So the only choices I had, oh, by the way, we had some physical and hospital setbacks in there, and I had to take a year off of school. And this man, Jerry Ford, the room you're sitting in, right? I lost my GI Bill. In other words, the provisions of the GI Bill was if you interrupted your education for more than a year, you lost it. So I lost my $160 a month, right? I couldn't go back to school. So I went to see him. And he used to have a trailer that he used to come around the different sections of town. I remember he was in Comstock Park, and the trailer was parked there, so I went in to talk to him, and we sat down. All his aides were there. It was a very formal atmosphere, and I explained my case. I said, hey, we had some, we had hospital bills and this and that, and I couldn't afford to go back to school. So I lost my GI Bill. Well, it turns out that Jerry was chairman of the Appropriations Committee for the Armed Forces. Within 2 days, I got a telegram from Detroit saying, come down to Detroit to the Veterans Administration and plead your case, and bang, I had my GI Bill back. And therefore, I finished, I got to go back to Aquinas and finish. I finished in mathematics because I had all the math done anyhow at the junior college. I did take physics and phys ed, right? So, and the others, that leads us to the next significant event. So I got 2 of them, the plane crash and Jerry Ford, right? I don't know if that's really significant, but it sure changed my life.
Yeah.
The other one was that, well, I was at Aquinas. I was studying math, and I was studying physics, because for God, read Spanish. I had to take 2 years of a foreign language to get out of school. But anyhow, as I was plodding through all these courses, and one day somebody said, well, what do you do with a degree in mathematics? Right? I have no idea which direction I was going in. But somebody said, well, did you go down and sign up? And I said, sign up for what? She said, well, for teaching certificate. I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I went down, and this big long line, I got in line, I got up to the counter, and they said, sign here, what are you, mathematics, or I signed fact, okay. So they put me in teaching courses, and that's how I wind up as a school teacher, by accident. I had no idea, right? And fortunately, when I, the year I graduated was 1959, the Russians had sent up Sputnik. And all of a sudden, math was important. I mean, everybody had to have math because you sent rockets up into space, you know. And here I was, a math major. So I applied to teach school at Grand Rapids. Ben Bukema was the superintendent, who was a staunch Christian Reformed person, and he didn't hire me. Why? Because I was a graduate of Aquinas. He wanted Calvin graduates. That's who he wanted. So I went out to see Roscoe Minor at Godwin Heights. Bang, I had a job just like that. I started teaching school in the fall of 1959, and you know the rest, right? Interesting career. I don't regret not doing it. I was a good teacher, maybe a little stern.
We've heard stories.
Hammer and tongue.
We've heard stories.
No nonsense, right? Stand up and I'll knock you down. No back talk. But then I got into administration, of course, and became executive director of the second largest adult education consortium in the state of Michigan. But what I want to tell the grandkids is that, hey, don't ever rule anything out. I grew up in a factory town. There was no hope of ever going to college, ever. I was destined for the factory, just like my brothers, my sisters, my mother, my father. They all worked in the factories. They produced Nashes, they produced mattresses, you know, all this stuff. And only the rich kids went to college. Right? But that's not true. If you really want to do it, and if you have a partner that will support you and be with you in the good things and the bad things, you can't miss.
Bravo.
Now I can sit down.
Everybody